Welcome to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. Well, as we spend increasingly more and more time chatting with one another through screens and text messages, and less time in face-to-face communication, we're losing an important 21st century skill. Perhaps the most important 21st century skill, and that's how to sustain a conversation with someone, even if you disagree with them. Now, we've all had great conversations before. You know the feeling. You walk away feeling uplifted, motivated, inspired. You feel like you've made a real connection or that you've been perfectly understood. We all have so much to learn from one another, but as our politics and our opinions become increasingly more polarized, we very much lost sight of this. Now, there's no reason we can't be having more authentic, difficult, and yet civilized conversations in our lives. In fact, our health, our happiness, and our most fundamental relationships depend on this. Whether you're looking to make a connection, learn something new, negotiate your salary, or get what you want in an adversarial situation, our panel of experts tonight are going to help you get a little bit closer to achieving all of those things through the lost art of conversation. First, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Harry. Jeff helps companies create psychologically safe workspaces through the use of play. Jeff has worked with Google, Microsoft, Southwest Airlines, Adobe, the NFL, Amazon, Facebook, and many others, helping their staff to infuse more play in the day-to-day. For his work, Jeff was selected by Bamboo HR and Engagedly as one of the top 100 HR influencers of 2020, and his work has most recently been featured in the New York Times, Mashable, and Upworthy. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ruth Sermon, who has been helping people resolve conflicts for more than 25 years, with a focus on helping organizations turn toxic work environments into places where people actually want to come to work. Ruth's ability to relate to people, her frankness and insight, and her ability to ask the tough questions have helped clients regain control over their lives and their workplaces. Ruth is an International Mediation Institute certified mediator and a member of Mediators Beyond Borders. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ruth.
It's a pleasure to be here, Barbara.
And finally, I'm so pleased to introduce our panelist, Christine McKay. Christine is a global negotiation strategist and international speaker, author of the book, Why Not Ask? A Conversation About Getting More, and the host of the podcast, In the Venn Zone. Christine has worked her way up from being homeless, having 3 children by the age of 22, and living on welfare for almost a decade, to earning her MBA from Harvard University. Christine has negotiated for clients large and small, including nearly half of the Fortune 500s and across 53 countries. She's been happily married for 28 years. Thank you so much for joining us, Christine. Welcome.
Thank you, Barbara. It's an honor to be here.
Now, I want to start by asking all the panelists to tell us a little bit about your backstory and how you ended up in this line of work. How did conversations become your calling? Jeff, let's start with you.
Sure. So mine is a really roundabout way. I saw the movie Big as a kid with Tom Hanks, and he was working and he was getting to play with toys for a living. And I was like, oh, I want to be in the toy industry. So I wrote toy companies until I got in 20 years later. And then I was actually in these toy companies. And a lot of them were not having quality conversations. They were not addressing really important issues. And I remember leaving, going to the Bay Area and growing like one of the largest Lego-inspired STEM organizations like in the US. And while we were doing that, we actually started running team building events for a lot of the companies that you mentioned earlier, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Adobes, the top tech companies in the world. And we found that at the same time they talked about disruption, innovation, risk taking, but the one thing they weren't doing was they were not allowing their staff to actually play and take risks the way in which they were speaking. And the reason why was they hadn't built psychologically safe workspaces where people could have difficult conversations and really connect as human beings.
I love how you see communication as this big sandbox, and I want to hear more about some of the activities that you engage in, Jeff. But sometimes it's time to bring out the big guns, which leads me to ask you next, Christine. Tell me a little bit about how you got into this line of work, and what do conversations look like for you and your clients?
Well, after I started working after I graduated from college, after living in the back of my car, I learned, kind of moving from being homeless to welfare to getting to Harvard, that life was all about negotiation. And I started out working in international mergers and acquisitions. And there was one deal in particular, this predated the euro. And it was in Belgium, and Belgium was trying to sell part of its state-owned telephone company. And I was responsible for getting my company at the time and two others to agree to a single number to put in a bid document. And it was one of the most exciting jobs that I ever got to do. I was in love, because the idea of taking all these disparate ideas, cultures, ideologies, and philosophies, and getting them to agree to something concrete and actionable was really exciting for me. And it launched me on a career working across corporations across the globe. But I'm from North Central Montana, and I grew up in a really tiny town. And as I worked with those big companies, I saw how smaller organizations were really taken advantage of and are at a disadvantage when it comes to negotiating effectively. So they accept deals from customers or suppliers or investors because they think they have to, and they're afraid of asking for more. And so I love being able to help them level the playing field and ask for more so that they can get more of what they want.
And of course, just your own personal journey getting from homeless to Harvard requires harnessing such a great deal of courage. And of course, having a difficult conversation is all about courage. So I want to talk more about those parallels. But first, I want to hear from you, Ruth. How did you get into this line of work?
Through a very, very roundabout way. This is career number 4.
Wow.
And so when I first, my background's actually in science, and I worked primarily in the scientific field initially, and then ended up becoming an entrepreneur and raised 4 kids, and realized that wasn't going quite as well as I would like it to go. You know, all those times when we start thinking about all the things we promised ourselves that we would never say to our children.
Yep.
And every time I would find myself under fire, I would open my mouth and my mother would come out. And that wasn't necessarily what I was looking to say or how I wanted to deal with things. And I started getting involved in trying to figure out how you managed 4 kids, a farm, a couple of businesses, and a few other things that were going on. And somebody said to me at one point, you should be a mediator. And I looked at them and said, what's a mediator? Because we weren't using it in those days for much of anything other than collective agreement negotiations. And so the mediator was the individual who went back and forth between the 2 hotels, where you had the employer on one side and you had the union on the other side. And we certainly weren't using it in the same way that we do now. So first I had to find out what it was, and then I, quite by accident, ended up in a course that wasn't quite what I expected, and discovered it was a mediation course, and things kind of took off from there. But if you'd asked me 25 years ago if I would be doing what I'm doing now, the answer would have been a resounding no. Not quite sure where I thought I would be. It certainly wouldn't be doing the kind of work, speaking, training, mediating across Canada, internationally, and in so many fascinating environments that I never really expected. So it's been kind of an interesting journey to get here. I'm interested to see where the next 20 years go.
And obviously all your life experience has played such an important role in building the foundation for what it is that you do for a living now. What was the best conversation you've had recently, or the last great conversation you've had, Ruth, and what made it so fulfilling?
I think great conversations happen, Barbara, when you're either hesitant to get into it because you're not sure how it will go. And I think if you asked anyone on the planet, have you ever felt something should be discussed or raised or resolved or whatever, and you chose not to do it, I don't know of anybody who could legitimately say they've never been in that position. There are so many reasons why we choose not to get into conversations. But I think when we get into a conversation where we really don't know what the outcome is going to be, we're really uncertain as to whether or not it's going to make a difference, then when it does, it just becomes such a high. That's probably the best description for it. And although this isn't super recent, that I was talking before we came on air about an opportunity I had to speak in the Middle East at one point. And I went to do a keynote presentation, but this was a conference that involved people from all over the Middle East region, including people from a number of different countries, and Israel was one of those countries. And things got very tense a couple of times because there's no shortage of conflict in that part of the world. And it ended up kind of coming to a head in one of the breakout sessions that, and it wasn't actually even involving the Israelis, but it happened to be in their breakout session. And as it got more and more heated, people started coming in, and one of the conference organizers came in and he said, well, this is a conference on managing conflict, so we need to do something about this. And he looked at me and he said, Ruth, I'd like you to mediate it. And I was a little speechless. Doesn't happen very often, but I certainly was then. So I ended up with somewhere between 70 and 75 people, different religions, different language backgrounds, different nationalities and ethnicities, and just an incredibly eclectic global group, but with some very tough issues that they needed to address. And they actually agreed to have this conversation, and they agreed to talk for 45 minutes. In the long run, we went 6.5 hours, which if you have ever been to a conference, you can appreciate the challenge that created for the conference organizers. But in the end, we had Israelis shaking hands with Palestinians, Lebanese shaking hands with Israelis, Jordanians shaking hands with Israelis, with people who had never met before, having conversations that carried over into the rest of the conference. And it was spectacular to see how this group of people actually stepped up and made it happen, and the impact that it had on the quality of the conversations that people had for the rest of the conference.
And that just speaks to the power of having a great conversation and what it can achieve for us.
I'm not hearing your audio, Barbara.
And it's such a shame that it doesn't happen more often. So we're just going to break after this. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Hey everybody, it's Mark in the Park.
Tune in to Rogers TV and watch Mark in the Park as I go on a 10-day interior canoe trip in Algonquin Provincial Park.
We get some hard times, some sweaty times. This isn't rain. And some old times with lots of relics around the park.
Lots of fun and pain. Canoeing. Awesome. Portages. Not so awesome. You're lucky there is no such thing as smell-o-vision.
Play 4 games of bingo from the comfort of your own home each Monday at 7 p.m. for your chance to win money from our $2,000 regular bingo or $5,000 super bingo night. Kiwanis TV Bingo, Mondays at 7 p.m. on Rogers TV.
Hi, welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. On tonight's show, we're talking about having difficult conversations even with someone who disagrees with you. Daryl Davis is a blues musician in Chicago with an interesting hobby. For the past 30 years, Davis, who is a black man, has spent time befriending members of the Ku Klux Klan. Since he started talking with them, he says 200 Klansmen have given up their robes. Davis collects them and keeps them at home as a reminder of the dent that he's made in racism simply by sitting down and having dinner with people. Now, how do we channel that little bit of Daryl Davis in all of us? How do you channel that patience, that empathy, that understanding, especially these days when we're so quick to cancel, dismiss, and hit delete? Now, Jeff, you recently had a 3-hour conversation with a Trump supporter. It's my understanding that you're not a Republican. Was that one of the most interesting or best conversations you ever had? And how did that feel for you?
It was humbling. I learned this from my friend Eric Bailey. You either go into a conversation to understand or you go into a conversation to be right. And she and I had to constantly check ourselves to be like, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to understand? Are we listening to respond? Or are we listening to actually really connect on an empathetic level with one another? And some of the biggest lessons I learned from just that conversation was, first, acknowledging other people's experience, even if you disagree with it, not conflating, where they stand with the single demographic, and actually just being curious. I learned this from my friend Keisha, was saying, fear, the acronym for fear is false evidence appearing real. And the reason why it was such a long conversation is we had to cut through all of the assumptions that we had and really question them and really try to connect with each other at a human level and realize we have the same values. In many ways we do. We just have a different way in interpreting that. And then from that foundation, then we could actually have a respectful conversation.
Now, it's interesting the point that you make about not conflating everyone into sort of a single demographic, because if you look at the way scientific experiments are conducted, for instance, you only take a sample to test a hypothesis and then you come to a general conclusion. So how do we stop ourselves from having our minds operate the same way? Do we acknowledge the fact that there are many outliers? How do you go about doing that?
Well, I think we have to first ask ourselves, are we telling ourselves we're the hero of our own story, right? And how does that help us look good, right? Why is everyone else a villain in this story? When I'm working with a lot of companies, if you're focused on winning all the time, winning that conversation, then you're not ready to have that conversation. And I think, again, we have to come from a place of curiosity and also challenging our own rooted beliefs. I now speak more about, if you're so sure about something, the more sure you are about it, the more you should start actually questioning it to see if that really is the case, or is that just you telling that hero story so that everyone feels wrong while you feel right?
Christine, talk to us about the best conversation you've ever had and how you were able, I guess, to preserve the relationship in more adversarial negotiation work that you do.
Oh, I love that question. There are a lot of adversarial situations. I think the one that stands out the most from an adversarial perspective that I was able to turn around was I had been working for a client and we were negotiating a very large transaction with a very large company. And the head of sales wasn't very excited that I was involved, and I had been brought in by the CEO and the CFO. And there were two vice presidents of sales, and they decided they didn't want to play. They decided to disengage from the negotiation process. The CEO and the CFO were like, you've got to keep moving forward. We can't stop. We're on a deadline. So I kept moving forward, continually trying to engage the VPs of sales. And when we hit a point where the deal was closing, they again refused to engage. But after the deal was signed and the CEO, the chairman of the board, and the CFO were delighted with the transaction, it came to our attention that the sales force was selling outside the terms of the contract. And so I found out first, I raised it, went into a meeting with the 2 vice presidents and 5 of their direct reports. And it started with them, the 7 of them, screaming at me, like in my face, calling me names. One of them nearly threw something at me.
Wow.
It was acrimonious.
How did you hold yourself together in that kind of situation? How do you push through?
So in a business situation, so it's not true if your physical safety is in danger, and so I'm going to put that kind of concept to the side, but it's very rare in a business situation when your physical safety is in danger. And so essentially what I did is I pushed away from the table because it was clear that there was nothing that I was going to be able to do or say that was actually going to change their perspectives at that moment in time. And I have a saying that a boiling teapot eventually runs out of steam. And so I let them go. I just let them say what they needed to say. I asked for clarifications periodically. And when the teapot eventually ran out of steam, I concluded the meeting and I left. And then I went about having one-on-one conversations with every single person in that meeting. And I love what Jeff said, because one of the things that I think that we, especially as adults, we've forgotten to do is to be curious about what is driving somebody, what are their objectives, what's worrying them, what are their concerns. And we focus so often on what we want, and we become myopically focused in many cases on what it is we want, that we forget that when we're in a different conversation with a counterpart, whether that is a business relationship, a customer, a supplier, an employee, or whether it's our partners in our home lives or our children, right? We forget that there's more to be had when we think about everything together. And I always say that in negotiation is a hopeful act. We enter into it at the present point in time, informed by our history, but with an eye toward the future, that things will be better as a result of the relationship going forward. And if we believe that, then the notion of being curious about ourselves, as well as our counterparts, and as well as about the situation and the environment that we're in, it sets us up for addressing and dealing with those difficult conversations. And it makes it so that it becomes more focused about the relationship as a whole, and not just that specific situation at hand.
I love everything you're saying about the curiosity aspect of that, because so often we're just quick to hit the delete button instead of asking, why, or where did that come from, or how can I help change your mind? Now, I'm curious as to your thoughts on this, Ruth. So many of us are hesitant to broach a difficult topic or enter a difficult conversation because we're afraid of what might happen. We might be afraid of, for instance, losing the relationship. And what I've heard when I get advice from people in situations like that, the advice is always, well, then it's okay that you've lost the relationship. I imagine it's a bit different if you negotiate for a living versus in your personal life, but I know you have some thoughts on this, Ruth. I'd love to hear them.
Well, first off, I mean, if a relationship falls apart, then I think that's always unfortunate, if there was some way of salvaging it. But I think there are a lot of times where we're hesitant to go into those conversations because we're not sure how to raise questions or issues without perhaps making it worse, or without adding fuel to the fire, as my grandmother would have said. We may not be quite comfortable in terms of how we're going to manage ourselves in that situation. What if I get mad? What if I lose my cool? What if my brain goes blank and I can't think of what to say? What if I start to cry, and those kinds of questions that we put on ourselves. But there's another piece that I think it's worth considering, is that often we do the cost risk benefit analysis in one direction of all of those negative reasons why, maybe we shouldn't have that discussion. We don't necessarily do the cost risk benefit analysis in the other direction about, well, what if we don't? What if we just let things fester? What if we don't raise the issues, clear the air, find a solution? Then what's that going to be like? And so as a result, we can sometimes walk away from things that were actually quite manageable. And there's nothing that says that you have to be able to do it on your own. If you need some help, ask somebody to help. There are all kinds of people, every teacher, every manager, every parent, most neighbors have at some point in their life filled what I would call that informal mediation role, where, they're helping other people to try and sort things out. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, and it goes back to something that I think it was Jeff said around, how we see ourselves and staying curious as opposed to just gathering ammunition to be able to retaliate. The other thing that I've found incredibly useful when I start talking to people about having these tough conversations is realizing that the rest of the world may not necessarily share my vision of me. And somebody had put it perfectly years ago when they said in every conversation between two people, there are 6 personalities that are present in that discussion. There's me as I see myself, and we all have a well-developed vision of who we are, how we do things, what our intentions are, and so on. And so when something isn't going well, we will sort through what's going on, often based on our vision of ourselves and what we know we're trying to do. The challenge is that the second part of that is how other people see us or how other people experience us. And that may not be the same. And then there's me as I really am, which, is probably somewhere in the middle. And the other person gets the same 3 dynamics. So I could see myself as quiet and reserved, but you might experience me as cold and withdrawn. Those are not the same dynamics. And they have very different impact on conversations and on what other people perceive. I could see myself as being friendly, supportive, helpful, and you might see me as being rude, pushy, and obnoxious or in your face. And so you're going to react based on what you're experiencing, and I'm going to react based on what I think I'm projecting.
It's amazing how those perspectives
can get us into an awful lot of trouble.
It's amazing how those perspectives can vary. We're just about to go to commercial break, but when we come back, we'll hear more from Jeff Harry on the important role of play in having authentic and difficult conversations. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
They served to protect our homes. Now many are homeless. They fought for our way of life. Now many are fighting personal battles of their own. They answered the call for our country. Now we honor them by serving our communities. Help us help Canada's veterans. Become a Legion member today.
Looking for the best way to get the Major League Baseball games you want to watch? Rogers Super Sports Pack has you covered. With MLB Extra Innings, you'll have a premium ticket to out-of-market regular season games with all games available in HD. Don't miss the action from the games you want from both the American and National Leagues. MLB Extra Innings, part of the Super Sports Pack. For only $35.95 a month, Rogers customers get all this for one all-inclusive price. Order using your remote starting on channel 431 or visit Rogers.com today.
Are you a woman experiencing abuse? Do you know a woman experiencing abuse? Help is available any time of day or night. ShelterSafe.ca is an online map that helps you find a women's shelter or transition house that meets your needs so you can live a life free from violence. ShelterSafe.ca. Help is just a click away.
Join us as we look back at previous investiture ceremonies honoring great Canadians. Watch the Order of Canada exclusively on Rogers TV.
Barbara Balfour. On tonight's show, we're talking about how to have a difficult conversation with someone who disagrees with you. I want to start with you, Jeff. Jeff, you see the art of communication as being this great big sandbox, and that play can go a long way in terms of building trust and fostering inclusivity. Talk to us about some of the activities and exercises that you engage in to achieve those goals or outcomes.
Sure. So I see play as almost the opposite of perfection, and perfection is rooted in like ego and shame and scared of failure, while play is all about failure. It's all about experimentation. It's all about curiosity. It's all about like, let's try this out. So when I'm running a lot of these workshops, a lot of what we're doing is we're role playing, because if you think about work, we never get to practice. In the US, in NFL, we practice all week for a 3-hour game. But when it comes to work, like, we don't get to practice difficult conversations. We don't get to practice how to lead, how to manage. How many people do you know that are managers that never learned how to become a manager? So when are we going to have those conversations and actually sit in the awkwardness? So in the workshops we do, we actually role play out the workshop. If we're running a workshop on dealing with toxic people at work, it's just like, how would you say it? How would you talk to that person? How would you address their behavior and not attack their character? Here, let's do it again. Here, let's do it again. And then you start to see people being like, oh, you know what? This is not that bad. I can actually do this. And I think tying back to what Ruth was saying earlier about what is this costing you? What is this costing your business? Studies from SHRM found that $223 billion were lost last year due to the last 5 years in Fortune 500 companies due to turnover because of a toxic person. So we're losing staff at an exponential rate. And when you're able to have a difficult conversation, you can create a psychologically safe workspace. And what are the benefits of that? Higher morale, higher productivity, lower turnover, higher revenue. So like this, there's a actual monetary value to having difficult conversations and creating that psychologically safe workspace.
I couldn't agree with you more. And by the way, I love your bow tie, very snappy.
I felt like I should dress up.
What are some of the stories that we tell ourselves or that you've heard clients tell themselves that get in the way of having those difficult conversations?
That it's not possible. That the old story that we believe, like, how many times have you heard from companies, we've always done it this way, so we can't change, right? And like, that's the thing that we have to ask ourselves constantly. If you're a team leader watching this right now, ask yourself, how would you define your culture? Ask your staff, how would you define the culture? Because there's a lot of unwritten rules that we just assume people know when we actually haven't even had discussions around that. So we have to explore, what are we doing that's not working? What are these unsaid assumptions that we have? And why are we not willing to get awkward, get uncomfortable, and knowing that we're going to make mistakes during this? Because I think a lot of times we're striving for perfection when it's just like, you're not going to have perfection. It's going to be a ton of mistakes. It's going to be really messy. Hey, guess what? That difficult conversation, it's not going to be one conversation and then everything's perfect. This is going to last 3 months, 6 months. But if we're willing to constantly come back to the table and be like, I'm here to understand you. I'm not here to be right. I'm here to actually understand. That's when we can all start to build back the community and build that psychological safety that we need in order for our company to thrive.
And I think what's key is you can't always do both. You can't always be right and listen to understand. Now, what we may not realize is a lot of those conversations, a lot of those negotiations occur within our own heads. And I imagine, Christine, that you had to deal with a lot of those perhaps self-limiting beliefs as you climbed upwards in your journey from homeless to Harvard. I want to hear about some of the stories you told yourself and some of the negotiations you had with your own self to get to where you are today, and whether you see any parallels with the conversations that you mediate and facilitate.
So absolutely. I often say that the hardest part of any negotiation is the negotiation we have between our ears, because what we tell ourselves is what is going to become a reality. And so many times I've done it. We've all done it. I see it in all my clients. It's like, well, I want this, but if I ask for it, then I'm going to be judged. And when I first stopped living in the back of my car, I was 6 months pregnant. I'd lost like 25 pounds in my first 2 trimesters and was not healthy. But I met this woman who challenged me to write down 4 goals. And the only one I remember was that I was going to go to Harvard. And I remember going to the welfare office and they said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to go to Harvard. And they laughed at me. And of course they laughed at me. I mean, I laughed at me when I heard it coming out of my mouth. But everything I started to do, I kept that dream in mind. And I made a lot of missteps along the way. I had 3 kids at 22 while I was trying to do it, and was married to a not nice guy who didn't believe that I should do it. And so I had to find other people and surround myself with people who believed in me at moments when I didn't believe in myself. And this is something that I don't see many businesses doing as effectively as they could. Hiring the right coaches, the right advisors, putting the right people on boards, putting advisory boards of directors, people who believe in them but push them and challenge them and expect more from them. And because we rise to the level of other people's expectations. And I was fortunate enough to find people who pushed me hard. And, it's, the things that Jeff is saying, I just resonate with so much, because what is that old story that you're telling yourself? What is that past that you keep living and reliving over and over again that has you stuck in the same place? Because when we are in difficult situations and we allow ourselves to get drawn into the screaming match, the arguing, the need to be right, it's because we're reliving a past that isn't here anymore, but we're just so stuck in it that we can't move outside of it. And it's when we let ourselves, going back to the word, I think, of this whole thing is curious, when we let ourselves be curious about ourselves, our situation, and the people around us, it allows us to move into the present and gives us the ability to then think about what the future is and act in that from that perspective instead.
Very, very inspirational story, Christine. Thank you so much for sharing. It's incredible how even in today's world, with all the information and sort of sources and opinions that are available at our fingertips, it's still so easy to create our own echo chamber. And so I want to hear from you, Ruth. What are some of the steps you actively take to, whether consciously or subconsciously, not get stuck in an echo chamber? How do you get out and talk to other people and make sure you're hearing lots of other opinions and perspectives and points of view?
Well, I think Jeff's point about being curious is critical. We often talk about exercising our judgment, and judgment's a great thing. Judgment helps keep us from stepping out in front of cars that are coming down the street. Judgment keeps us from spending all of our money, on frivolous things. But being judgmental is a totally different dynamic, because what it does is it stops us from hearing what other people are thinking. It puts us into that realm of assessing and judging other people's interactions and reactions and so on. And we can also do it to ourselves. So being able to step back from that, and I know in mediation training they often talk about suspending judgment, and it's not suspending your rational judgment, it's suspending being judgmental. And when you can do that and stay curious and kind of go into the mindset of, isn't that interesting, as opposed to, oh, I can't believe they said that, then it allows us to stay in a more curious place. And that echo chamber, we need to deal with that on a couple of levels. it's important for me to deal with the echo chamber in my own head, but we create a second echo chamber when we get into difficult conversations sometimes, and it can be problematic. So if I were to ask a room full of people, how many of you have ever laid in bed at night and scripted out the conversation that you want to have with somebody? I'll say this, then they'll say this, then I'll say this, then they'll say this. And then when you get into the actual conversation, they don't follow their lines. And so it falls apart. And then we look at them and go, well, you didn't do it right. And now it's all your fault because, and realistically, if you go to a theater production, everybody has the script. If I write a script and I don't share it with the other person, then I can't really expect them to follow the lines that I've written for them that they know nothing about. So I think the echo chamber is also to recognize that if you're planning for this kind of a difficult conversation, and it doesn't hurt to give it some thought, you also have to plan for, well, what if they accept what I'm saying? How am I going to deal with that? What if they get upset? How am I going to manage that? So that you have pre-thought through some of the strategies that you could use in a very constructive way to help keep that conversation going. Because oftentimes for many of us, when we feel we've been blindsided by something we weren't expecting, then it becomes more difficult. So I'm not talking about making sure that you have everything down to the final I and the final cross on the T, and that it's more about just making sure that as you're going through, you're being realistic about what happens, and that you're recognizing the echo chambers when they're happening.
Thank you so much, Ruth. We're just about to go to commercial break, but when we come back, more on negotiation tips and strategies in everyday situations. We'll be right back after this.
My mother said we had to leave home. The communists were going to take my father away. If my parents were afraid, they didn't show us. But we would never forget our escape from Vietnam. We were lost.
What was your job in Vietnam?
University professor.
We had no home.
Do you have any family in Canada?
No, sir.
Nobody wanted us.
Welcome to Canada.
Canada chose us.
Canadians open their borders, their homes, and their hearts to more than 100,000 refugees fleeing persecution after the Vietnam War.
We were home.
That he fell. Whoa, I'm not driving. I'm way too stoned. How are you feeling, Beer?
Oh, since we had that talk, I'm not driving tonight at all.
What about you, Dave?
You only had a couple of drinks.
And only a couple of puffs.
I don't drink and drive. No way I'm getting behind the wheel when I smoked weed, too.
How are we getting home, then?
Oh, you can drive, Dave.
Come on, Dave.
Take one for the team, buddy.
Don't let weed and alcohol influence your decision to drive.
Yeah, I need a ride.
Hi, I'm Harriet Clooney. Come check out my show, Scrap Cooking, where I'm going to show you how to use the bits and bobs, the ends, the pieces of things that you might otherwise throw in the compost. I'm going to show you how to turn them into something delicious. October 5th, 2014, my daughter was hit by a train. She was walking along the sides of the tracks, and it shattered her world.
Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. Jeff, I want to talk to you about what are some fatal faux pas that we should steer clear from in a difficult conversation, whether it's in the workplace or maybe it's with family members who have different political points of view. I know that's especially the case in multi-generational families. You know, how do you let the other side see where they're coming from without dismissing their experience and their wisdom that led them to believe what they do?
I think that's the biggest one that you just said, denying their experience. I think we do that all the time. And when what do people want most? They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be loved.
Absolutely.
And when you are saying that actually did not happen to you, you believe this certain like political value, but actually everyone is brainwashed. What you're really saying to them is like, I don't see you. And I choose not to see you, and I don't see you as a human being, and like that's harsh. That hits you on the gut level. So I think we have to first be thinking about, all right, how am I going about having this conversation where my main goal is to walk away with a better understanding of you, not like that you have a better understanding of me, and that you feel like I've won. I don't think anyone's ever had a conversation with someone where at the end of it, someone was like, you were right. Like, you're absolutely right, and I'm completely wrong. Like, that just doesn't happen. It's never happened ever that way. Yet we go into conversations believing that, and then I think tying back to what Ruth was saying earlier is we also have to look at what are our examples in the media of people actually navigating difficult conversations. Most of the time, people are just having speeches next to each other. That's all they're doing. They're just, I'm talking, then you're talking, then I'm talking, you're talking. And no one's actually trying to understand one another. And what we need to do instead is be willing to be like, all right, I'm going to stop inundating myself with media, because I think we get more information in a day from media than people in the 1950s got in an entire year. So this is constantly telling us what we need to hear or what we're supposed to believe, and instead actually go out. Like I did speaking to someone that, disagreed with me politically. We actually had this conversation for 3.5 hours. And what was the result of that? There were 1,000 people on YouTube watching it live, and a couple people even wrote that were like, I like this conversation. I like that you two are having this conversation. I think I'm going to reach out to someone I disagree with politically. And then it has that ripple effect that it's not that bad, and that we can actually heal the world one conversation at a time.
That's truly the way in which you see change. I absolutely agree with you. Now, your practice, your philosophy really centers around the use of play, but sometimes it's time to bring out the big guns. Sometimes you're dealing with a narcissist or a sociopath. I want to hear from you, Christine. How do you deal with those kinds of situations? Is there ever a time when it's not possible to have a conversation and you just need to walk away?
So there are times when I'm not the right person to have a conversation and somebody else might be, because there's one situation where I had somebody from a very, very large professional services organization who was just not willing to engage with anybody. And he was cruel. He wouldn't, in his emails, but he wouldn't pick up the phone. He wouldn't talk to people. And so I intentionally set up a situation where I would cause him to act in a way that would remove me as his primary interface, because I knew that I was not in a position to hear what he was saying, and he was never going to be in a position to hear what I was going to say. And there were a number of reasons for that. One was because of my gender. One was because of my nationality. And so I made it so that somebody who he could see himself in was essentially became the mouthpiece of the negotiation. I still did the entire negotiation. I was in the meeting with that person. I'd hit the mute button and I'd say this, do this. He's asking this. And that person would then act, in accordance with that strategy that we'd already previously discussed. But it was a way of diffusing that situation, because sometimes you're not the right person to have the conversation, and you have to acknowledge that. That goes back to what we've been saying before about being curious enough about yourself. I mean, being a lifelong student of Christine McKay has been an important criteria to my being a successful negotiator, because I know when I'm in a situation that I'm not equipped to handle as effectively as maybe somebody else would be. But the other thing that I think is a huge thing is not asking the question why. Remove the question why out of your vocabulary, because it puts people immediately on the defensive. It means that you think that there's a better way of doing something or a different way of doing something. Somebody feels that they need to justify a position. Instead, be more open, ask more open-ended questions using what and how, and that informs curiosity. But one of my big things is if I hear myself asking a why question, I know that I'm stuck in my own past and in my own history, and that's a cue to me that I'm trying to be right and not being curious enough.
And it sounds like sometimes the key is in letting the other party feel like they have more control or agency or power than they might necessarily have. And this is a great segue to ask a question to Ruth. Do you have any easy tips and tricks for people who want to negotiate their salary with an employer, maybe the terms of their work contract, in such a way that the other party still feels like they have agency and that they're still getting a good deal? I guess it's a bit of an art form, isn't it?
It is. And oftentimes people are very reluctant to start talking about money. We either don't feel that that we should. There's kind of an unwritten rule that, you don't talk politics, religion, money, and so on. But also, oftentimes money is equated with value. And so I may be concerned that if I raise the topic of my salary, what if the boss says, well, you're not worth any more than what we're paying you. Actually, I'm not even sure that we're not paying you too much. Then is that going to strike right at the core of who I am and how I see myself? So people are often reluctant. I think when you go into those kinds of negotiations, it's important to think about how you want to raise it. You always want to make it or word it in such a way that it makes sense to the other person. And so think about what's important to them and how can you frame what you're going to say to them in a way that resonates with them. And it makes it hard for them to say no. And, as you get into the discussions, don't be afraid to look behind what they're saying. We often take words at face value. But for instance, people come in and they'll make statements like, I'm not paying you any more than you are, or I don't want to work with you, or whatever. Those are positions. Look at what's behind that. What is it this person really needs? And what do you really need? Not want, but need. And come at it from that. So people need to be treated fairly. They need to feel that their contributions are validated. They need to feel that they belong. They need to feel that they're safe and they're secure, and those types of things. So the kind of the core gut root issues that we have as human beings. So think of it like an onion. If you're peeling an onion, first off, you've got to go through a lot of layers. There may be a few tiers, but what's really important is right in the middle, and that's sort of what is of primary interest to somebody. And if you don't get it right, give yourself the space and grace to try it again.
It sounds like empathy is one of the most important skills you can possibly have when entering a negotiation or a difficult conversation. And Jeff, you have a lot of great resources on your website. And one of the resources is talking about the 3 different layers of empathy. Talk to us about that and how that plays a role in your line of work.
Yeah, so I was trying to think of like the things that tangibly are captured within empathy. And I think one of the best things you can do around difficult conversation is actually practice active listening. So that's actually reflecting back what that person has to say and really being like, oh, let me just reinterpret so that we're on the same page, right? So that's, I think, one of the first ones that's huge. Then another one regarding empathy is actually understanding where are they coming from? And then also, where are you coming from? What are your triggers? You should be going into a conversation knowing your triggers so that you know that when you're discussing this conversation with this person, you're not having a conversation from 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago, because many times we actually do a lot of that as well. And then thirdly, there is, what was the one that I really wanted to emphasize? But yeah, it is around trying to come from a standpoint of humility, and that we are working together to address this conflict. It's not that you're going against me and I'm going against you. It's that there's this conflict that's separate from us, but we're working together to address this conflict. So we're actually disassociating this from our own characters, and we're actually working together to address, as sometimes we do in my workshop, a scapegoat. We're going to blame the goat. Just keep blaming this absurd goat, because when you do something like that, you realize, like, oh my gosh, why am I so angry at this stuffed animal? Like, this is the way in which I am towards people, and I don't need to be this way. Like, let's take our egos out of it, and let's stop making it so serious and actually just try to connect from a human level.
I love the way how you encourage your audiences to look at the absurdity of the situation. I think we could all use a step back once in a while. We're unfortunately almost at the end of our time together, Jeff, but I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your website, some of the resources that are available, and how our audience can find you.
Absolutely. So you simply can go to rediscoveryourplay.com, click on the Let's Play button, where I have a bunch of resources on how to have difficult conversations. And then you can just hop on a phone call with me, and we can actually finally address how to create psychologically safe workspaces, especially in the post-pandemic world, because we're all about bringing more shared humanity back to work.
And now, Christine, you have a book and a podcast. We'll bring up those images on the screen now. How can we find you, get a hold of you, and get a copy of your book, or tune into your podcast?
Yes, so thank you very much. So you can go to vennegotiation.com, and you can click on the podcast page. Our podcast is called In the Ven Zone. We talk to a lot of different executives all over the world, and business owners and thought leaders. And it's a very different way of thinking about negotiation. And also on our website, you can pre-order my book, Why Not Ask a Conversation About Getting More. And you can also sign up to get a free gift on the 7 keys to successful negotiation, and set up some time to chat with me.
I love that. Thank you so much,
Christine,
Barbara,
for having me.
What an inspirational backstory, too. And we just have a couple minutes left till the end of our show. Ruth, any final points you want to share with our audience, and also where we can find you?
Well, you can find me if you go to canmediate.com. That gives you a sense of the kind of work that we do. Lots of training, lots of mediation services, and also lots of speaking at conferences and so on. You can contact me through there. Be happy to have a conversation with anybody. I think that the final point that I would want to make is, if you have to have difficult conversations, give yourself permission to do that, and give yourself and the other people the space and grace that if, when you get into the conversation, this is actually a good thing to agree on ahead of time. Sometimes we say things and it doesn't just quite come out the way we want it to. Mm-hmm. Give yourself the space then to be able to say, you know what, I don't think that's what I was trying to say. Can I try it again? And the other person then agrees to give you the grace to be able to allow you to do that. Because I think one of the biggest challenges we run into is, I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure that you realize that what you heard was not what I meant. And that can get us into an awful lot of trouble if we can't step back from that.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Ruth, Jeff, and Christine, for your time tonight, and for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your observations on how to have a difficult conversation with someone, even if you disagree with them. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio tonight. We'll see you again at 8 p.m. next week. Have a great night.
call the Rogers TV viewer response line. Email us or connect with us on social media.
Tastes like water, tastes like what? I'm going with water tastes like what? When I go down the line and the stars don't ever shine, I'm going down Cherry River line.
The Canadian Film and